Good evening. I want to begin by thanking you for the opportunity of being with you here this evening. Um, as been mentioned before, I spent 3 years on the campus of Harvard University as a graduate student at the Divinity School. I also worked for Harvard Alumni Association as a copy editor. The Yard was my home for a very formative time in my life. When I walked out of Harvard Yard for the last time in 2016 with my cap, hood, and gown, I had always thought, it's no problem. I'll be back very shortly. But unfortunately, life happened and responsibilities happened. Responsibilities associated with being a husband, father, and grandfather, and a soldier for the church. I haven't had an opportunity to come back. So for me, this is the closest that I've been able to come back, and I'm appreciative of that. As I get ready for this presentation, I want to set the parameters or let you know a few things. The subject matter tonight that we will be talking about at times may be a bit uncomfortable. As Catholics, we are accustomed to hearing presentations regarding candidates for sainthood in a very pious and happy, gooey, warm feeling way and language. However, due to the history of this nation and its treatment of African American citizens that cannot be ignored or whitewashed, pun intended, whenever we speak about the lives of African American citizens, even the lives of the faithful, even the lives of these candidates for sainthood, we will encounter stories of painful reminders of the bigotry and racist realities that are present even today. In our sacred scripture, the psalmist says, "Hear my words, O Lord. Listen to my sighing. Hear my cry for help." At this point, right now, everywhere in this country, African American families echo these words. They are communicating a despair on the streets, in their homes, and faithful African American Catholics are uttering these words in the pews. It is a despair induced by lives living under the crushing weight of an oppression that began over 400 years ago, when African American enslavement became the foundation upon which this nation was built. As despair it is a despair that has been burning like a slow-moving, fatal cancer. The utter despair of knowing that this land will never be our home, that we will never be considered its full citizens, and that none of us will ever be protected. The trauma of that despair chokes our spirit and makes it impossible to draw a healing breath. We cannot breathe. We once again sing the song of our ancestors. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. For over 400 or for over 4 centuries, the African American community has been enduring its own Black Holocaust. 246 years of slavery, 99 years of Jim Crow laws, 86 years of lynchings, and 14 years of fighting for civil rights. In recent months, this Black Holocaust has manifested itself in the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. This has placed the US population at a fork in the road. We stand on the precipice of monumental change or devastating regression in the area of race relations within our nation. In addition to this, despite the abolition of slavery, despite the dismantling of segregation, and despite the Christian social teaching on the sacredness of all life, the Universal Church remains one of the largest practitioners of segregation. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, 11 a.m. on Sunday is still the most segregated hour in the land. As a result, young African American youth and young adults today rather than turning to the church as an antidote to the vices of racialized culture in America, see the same patterns of separation in the church, thereby seeking alternative means to cope with racial tensions they are experiencing. What comes next will depend on how we, the faithful, respond. Whether that be Catholic or Protestant, how do we respond to the cries of the faithful, of the church's communities of color, declaring that their lives matter? St. Paul tells us, God has reconciled the world to himself in Christ, entrusting to us the message of reconciliation. As racism continues to manifest itself throughout our country, and often unconsciously within the Christian community, we must strengthen our efforts in continuing Christ's work of reconciliation. In our cherished Catholic tradition, one of the ways in which we are able to see how to live holy lives amid an extraordinary times, particularly times of pressure, particularly of times of grief, is through reflecting on the lives of the saints. For the African American Catholic community, we reflect on the lives of 6 significant African American figures in the history of the American Catholic Church. Now, if these names or the figures that you're about to see do not come readily to your mind, it's okay. I'm not surprised. In fact, the title of this talk, On the Road to Sainthood, Leaders of African Descent, I have to be honest, as I was preparing for tonight and I was reflecting on the title for this presentation, I think I made a little bit of a mistake. I should have emphasized that what we're talking about is American leaders of African descent. For there are numerous Catholic saints of African descent, including one of the fathers of the church, St. Augustine. We have St. Benedict the Moor. We have Saints Perpetua and Felicity, and St. Martin de Porres. However, there are no Black saints from the United States. There are a number of reasons for this lack of representation. First of all, as with any case for sainthood, there exists a tremendous expense, both financially and in time. The modern day canonization process can take decades or centuries, even being declared venerable, after which the candidates still have to be associated with 2 miracles before they can be recognized as saints. These miracles need to be meticulously investigated and documented, and then presented to the Vatican and affirmed by the Pope. Therefore, one of the biggest challenges is quite simply paying, fundraising to help with research and staffing. A couple years ago, in the summer of 2018, Xavier University of Louisiana, which, by the way, is the only historically Black Catholic university in the United States, teamed up with several national organizations to advance the sainthood causes of the 6 Black Catholic Americans that you will be introduced to this evening. On the campus of Xavier University, there is an Institute of Black Catholic Studies. It has been in existence for over 40 years. The plan is to create a resource center that will gather together the scholarly work, the research, and the funding to focus on the lives of the 6 candidates. In addition to the amount of research and funding the canonization process takes, there's the time of issue. The United States is a relatively young country. The United States has only produced 11 saints. Of course, none of these have been of African descent. Another reason for the lack of Black American representation among Catholic saints is due to the fact that a relatively small number of the population are actually Black Catholics. Most Black American Christians belong to historically Black Protestant denominations. Only 5% of African Americans are Catholic. And within the Catholic number, only 3% of Catholics are Black, versus 60% of American Catholics identifying as white. For most of its history, the U.S. Catholic Church has been predominantly European and white. Now, that doesn't mean American Catholics have all been European and white, but what it does mean is that the people who have been running the Catholic institutions and governing church culture have been European and white. In fact, over the years, it has become more and more evident that the American Catholic Church, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes consciously, participated in bigoted and racist actions. Quite frankly, the same racism that applied to Protestant American churches throughout the country, especially in the South, also applied to American Catholic parishes. As a result, there's a good chance that a large white Catholic community, even today, would not be aware of the contributions of the African American Catholic community to the church. Certainly, they would not know about specific individuals. In addition to the small number of African American Catholics in general, the early American Catholic Church, quite honestly, showed a disinterest in developing indigenous clergy among the Black community. They would assign missionaries to them, they would convert them, they would build schools for them, but early on, the church did not encourage vocations among them. Those who did sense the call to the religious life of the priesthood, for decades, were either told they were unsuited or unwelcomed to join American seminaries, convents, or houses of formation. As a result, even today, there is a significant lack of leadership representing the African American Catholic community. Here are some numbers for you to help put it in perspective. There are nearly 37,000 priests in the United States. Of that number, only 250 are African American priests. There are only 75 African American Catholics in seminary formation nationwide. The permanent diaconate, there are just over 18,000 permanent deacons in the United States. 440 are African American. U.S. bishops, there are about 430 active U.S. bishops in the United States. Only 5 are African American bishops. This means that just over 1% of all clerical leadership in the Roman Catholic Church in America are African American. And before you say, well, Cary, what about people like you? What about the laity? Currently, and this is before COVID, it's probably even less after COVID, only 33% of dioceses in the United States have offices committed to the pastoral care of African American Catholics. If only 1% of your leadership is African American, especially in parishes, then the opportunity for the larger Catholic community to be aware of the lives of these faithful Catholics in our history becomes less visible. And the African American Catholic community remains to be seen as a missionary field, a community that needs to be converted, a community that needs to be saved. Instead of being recognized as part of the church, as a contributing part of the life and history of the church for a very long time. Worse yet, the unfamiliarity with these figures of Catholic history leaves many African American Catholics and Catholics of color without knowledge of these faithful men and women like them that lived holy lives while dealing with the same pressures socially, spiritually, and emotionally. So I am here tonight to share with you the life of these faithful 6 holy men and women. My hope is that this is just a taste. I only have now a half hour to talk to you about 6 causes for sainthood. This is only going to be a taste of each candidate. My hope is that you will take what you receive tonight, do further research, learn upon a particular, pick one, and learn about them and their life and their contribution they have made to our tradition. I'm going to share with you, give me a moment here. About these 6 saints. The first is Venerable Pierre Toussaint. Pierre Toussaint was born a slave in 1766 in the French colony of Saint Dominique, which is modern day Haiti. His great grandmother had been born in Africa and sold in slavery in the Caribbean. Pierre worked as a house slave inside of a plantation owned by Jean Bernard. He was educated by the family's tutors, which was actually very unusual for the time. When the political unrest came to the island, his master sent his wife to New York for safekeeping in 1787 and sent Pierre and Pierre's sister, Rosalie, along with her. There in New York, Pierre was allowed to train as a hairdresser. He earned his own money. Yet when his owner's family fell on hard times, he used that money to take care of them. Madame Berard, his master's wife, promised to free him when she died, which she did in 1807 when Pierre was 41. Pierre did well as a hairdresser among the wealthy in New York. He purchased the freedom of another slave, Juliette Noel, and they married and adopted a daughter. From early on, the couple were very conscious of the needs of the poor. They opened their home to orphans and as a refugee to those in need. They experienced tragedy early when their daughter died at age 14. Pierre lived in an era when not only was he looked down upon as a freed slave, but anti-Catholicism was strong in New York at the time. However, it did not stop Pierre from professing his Catholic faith. He attended Mass every day for more than 60 years and had a high devotion to the Blessed Mother through the Rosary. He was also a teacher of the faith and could explain the church's teachings well and simply. In addition to helping others with the money he made, he gave a great deal of money to help finance the construction of the original St. Patrick's Cathedral on Mulberry Street. According to legend, it is said that on the day the cathedral was dedicated, Pierre went to the church for the celebration. But because he was Black, an usher would not allow him to enter. Pierre, who paid for so much of the cathedral's building, simply apologized and turned to leave. But another usher recognized him and immediately brought him to the seat of honor. When Pierre died in 1853, he was originally buried in the cemetery at the cathedral. But in 1990, the Cardinal of New York had his remains moved into the crypt of St. Peter's Cathedral, where only cardinals and archbishops are buried. Pierre is the only layperson to be so honored. He was venerated by St. John Paul II on December 17th, 1996. Shortly before his death, he said, "I have never felt I am a slave to any man or woman, but a servant of Almighty God, who made us all. When one of his children is in need, I am glad to be his slave." Many African American Catholics often ask for his intercession on matters of business and in their work for the most vulnerable in their communities. The other cause that is currently taking place is for Mother Mary Elizabeth Lange. Elizabeth Clarice Lange was born in late 1784 in Santiago, Cuba, where she was well educated and lived in a French-speaking community. By 1812, Mother Lange had immigrated to Baltimore, joining a large number of French-speaking Catholics from Haiti. While there are no historical records explaining why Mother Lange moved to the United States, historians believe that Mother Lange left Cuba rather than swearing an oath of allegiance to Spain, which had recently consolidated power on the island. After moving to the Falls Point area of Baltimore, Mother Lange discovered that there were few educational opportunities for Black children in the city. As a Southern state, Maryland practiced slavery, and many Black people in Baltimore at that time were enslaved. Meanwhile, free African Americans and the recent Haitian immigrants faced intense prejudice and were denied access to most schools. Mother Lange opened a school to anyone in her small home. Mother Lange's small school later attracted the attention of Father James Hector Nicholas Hobert, a former soldier who had fled the slave rebellion in Haiti. He sought to teach the recent Haitian immigrants Catholicism, but found that many did not know how to read. After visiting Mother Lange's small school in 1828, Father Hobert, with the backing of Archbishop James Whitfield, encouraged Mother Lange to found a religious order to educate African American girls. This order was the Oblate Sisters of Providence. They will become the first sustained religious order for women of African descent in the United States. Mother Lange, who had long wanted to be a nun herself, followed her calling and took the name of Mary. For decades, the Oblate Sisters of Providence were the sole providers of Catholic education for Black children in Baltimore. The sisters' school would eventually become St. Francis Academy, which is still in operation, the oldest continuously operating school for Black Catholic children in the United States. With little outside support, the sisters also performed other charitable work, including establishing homes for widows and orphans and treating the terminally ill during the cholera epidemic in 1832. After years of service to the church and the community, Mother Lange died in 1882 at her convent. The Oblate Sisters continue their work today, with about 80 sisters working in Maryland, Florida, New York, and Costa Rica. In 1991, the Catholic Church opened an investigation into her cause for sainthood, naming her Servant of God. The next cause is for Venerable Henrietta DeLille. Born in 1813, Henrietta DeLille was born a free woman of color and lived her life in New Orleans, Louisiana. Among Henrietta's relatives was her great-great-grandmother, who was a slave from West Africa. Her mother and the other women in her family formed liaisons, or serial monogamous relationships with white men. This means colored women who were basically concubines for wealthy white men. Therefore, Henrietta was biracial, thus her being able to be free. Yet at the same time, she experienced much prejudice because she didn't fit for the African American community, but she also didn't fit in the white community. When Henrietta was 24 years old, she underwent a religious experience. As a result of the experience, Henrietta drew up the rules and regulations for devout Christian women, which would eventually become the Society of the Holy Family. The group was founded for the purpose of nursing the sick, caring for the poor, and instructing the ignorant. 1842 was the date for the founding of the Sisters of the Holy Family. Henrietta was assisted by her friends, and records show that these women served as godmothers to many, whether they be slave or free, children or adult, and they also witnessed many marriages. They took into their home elderly women who needed more than visitation, and thereby opened America's first Catholic home for the elderly of its kind. Noteworthy are the heroic efforts of the early sisters who cared for the sick and the dying during the yellow fever epidemic that struck New Orleans in 1853 and 1897. In the eyes of the world, Henrietta may not have accomplished much, but her obituary and the Catholic Church tells us Henrietta devoted herself entirely for many years without reserve to the religious instruction of the people of New Orleans, principally of slaves. The last line of her obituary reads, "For the love of Jesus Christ, she became the humble and devout servant of the slaves." The Sisters of the Holy Family presented her for sainthood, and the request was granted by St. John Paul II in 1988. She was elevated to venerable by Pope Benedict XVI on March 27, 2010. The next candidate we will speak of is the servant of God, Julia Greeley. Julia Greeley was a familiar sight on the streets of Denver in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Wearing a floppy hat, oversized shoes, and dabbing her bad eye with a handkerchief, Greeley was often seen pulling her wet wagon of goods to deliver to the poor and homeless in the city. She had a particularly special devotion to the Sacred Heart, and every month would deliver on foot images of the Sacred Heart and information about prayer to firefighters throughout Denver. Born a slave in Hannibal, Missouri, sometime between 1833 and 1848, Greeley endured some horrific treatment. Once, her slave master was beating her mother, and Julia, as a young child, was standing nearby, and the whip caught Julia's right eye and destroyed it completely, which is the reason why she continuously had to dab her bad eye. Freed by Missouri's Emancipation Act in 1865, Julia subsequently earned her keep by serving white families domestically, beginning in Missouri, eventually ending in Colorado. And that's where she spent most of her time in the Denver area. Worked with the family of William Gilpin, which was a high society wealthy family, and Colorado's first territorial governor, brought her to Denver in about 1878. After leaving the governor's service, she found odd jobs around the city. At Sacred Heart Parish of Denver, Julia joined the Catholic Church in 1880. She was an enthusiastic parishioner, a daily communicant, and became an active member of the secular Franciscan order starting in 1901. The Jesuit priests at her parish recognized her as the most fervent promoter of devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Despite her own poverty, Greeley spent much of her time collecting food, clothing, and other goods for the poor. She would often do her work at night so as to avoid embarrassing the people she was assisting. Though she was earning only $10 to $12 a month, cleaning and cooking, she used much of it to help other people who were poor. Julia Greeley died on June 17, 1918, the feast of the Sacred Heart. Although her death came unexpectedly, she was able to receive last rites. It is estimated that she was around 80 years old, though because she was born in slavery, her exact age we don't really know. After her death, her body lay in state in a Catholic parish for 5 hours, during which a constant stream of people came to pay their last respects to the well-known, well-loved woman. There is only one known photograph of Greeley, and you have it there before you, holding a child she cared for. The Archdiocese of Denver opened Julia's case for canonization in December of 2016. They exhumed and moved her remains to the Cathedral Basilica of the Immaculate Conception, where she is the only person buried. This next case is probably the most well-known of the cases. And this is for Venerable Father Augustus Tolton. Born in Brush Creek, Missouri, around April 1st, around April 1854, John Augustus Tolton began life with the odds stacked against him. He began life without his God-given rights to freedom, dignity, and equality because he was born a slave. He began life not as a human being, but as someone's personal property. He was a slave of a white Catholic family. Augustus Tolton's early childhood coincided with the Civil War. His father, Peter Paul Tolton, escaped slavery to join the Union Army, while his mother, Martha, remained the maid of her owners. Despite his mother being a baptized Catholic, his mother, as well as him and the remainder of his family, suffered the inhumane treatment of being chattel slavery. Despite the adversities, human cruelties, and the hatred by his fellow man, Augustus Tolton had the love of Jesus Christ in his heart. In 1862, he and his family found the courage to escape slavery by bravely crossing the Mississippi River into Illinois. According to one report, when they reached freedom, Tolton's mother turned to him and said, "John, you're free. Never forget the goodness of the Lord." Augustus took his mother's advice and never forgot God's grace and mercy. Even though racial conflict haunted Tolton most of his life, he remained devoted to service in the Catholic Church. With the blessing of a loving man of God, Father Peter McGurr, Tolton was allowed to attend St. Peter's Catholic School, an all-white parish school in Quincy, Illinois. Father McGurr and others mentored and tutored him as they began to realize that Tolton was destined to greatness. After Augustus entered St. Peter, Father McGurr, who was the school's pastor, baptized him and prepared him himself for his first Holy Communion. Augustus Tolton devoted himself to serving God by making his life a living example of God's words. Unfortunately, despite the call that he felt in his heart, and despite the support of his pastor, no American seminary would accept him because he was a Black man. Without allowing his faith in the Lord to falter, Tolton eventually graduated from high school and attended Quincy College. And in 1880, With Father McGirr's continued support, Augustine began his studies for the priesthood in Rome. Prayer to God and trust that God answers prayer guaranteed the success of Father Tolton as he completed his training. He was an excellent student because everything he did and all he accomplished, he continued to give glory to the Lord. Augustus Tolton, born a commodity to be bought and sold, owned as a mere piece of property, blazed a trail while following God's call. He learned to speak fluent English, German, Italian, and Latin, Greek, and several African dialects. He became an accomplished and talented musician and had a beautiful voice. While he was in Rome, for the first time in his life, Father Augustus experienced racial harmony and total acceptance within the church. By the grace of God, he finally came to experience the love of his church and the Catholic Church. In 1886, after 6 years of study in the seminary, Tolton was ordained to the priesthood in Rome at the age of 31. He had accepted to serve and expected to serve in Africa as a missionary. Surprisingly, he was directed to return right back to the United States to serve in the community in which he came from, in Quincy, Illinois. Therefore, Father Augustus Tolton became the first Black American priest in the United States. Born as a slave in America, he became an American hero and still is to many Black Catholics. Tolton held his first public mass at St. Boniface Church in Quincy, Illinois, and eventually became pastor of St. Joseph Catholic Church and School. However, racial tension in Quincy ran rampant. Father Augustine's charismatic preaching and powerful word and powerful love for the community began to attract not only African American Catholics, but white Catholics from larger parishes. This caused attention in the city, and for fear of his life, he requested a transfer and was given a reassignment to Chicago. In Chicago, he gave particular attention to helping out the poor and the sick, feeding the hungry, and along the way, converting and winning souls for God. In 1897, the first Black Catholic priest in America, lovingly known as Good Father Gus, died unexpectedly while in a priest retreat. He was only 43 years old. Yet he left a legacy that will live forever. He was venerated by Pope Francis on June 12, 2019. The last case we will speak of is Sister, in the most recent case, is Sister Thea Bowman, a self-proclaimed old folks child. Sister Thea Bowman was the only child born to middle-aged parents. Her father was a physician, her mother a teacher. At birth, she was given the name Bertha Elizabeth Bowman. She was born in 1937 and lived in Canton, Mississippi. As a child, she converted to Catholicism through the inspiration of the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration and the missionary servants of the Most Holy Trinity, who were her teachers and pastors at Holy Child Jesus Church and School in Canton. These religious communities nurtured her faith and greatly influenced her religious vocation. Growing up, Thea listened and learned from the wisdom of the old folks, as she called them, the elders of her community. Ever curious, she asked questions and gained insights on how her elders lived, thrived, and survived. She learned from family members and those in her community coping with mechanisms and surviving skills. These skills prove essential as she navigated through the horrid experiences of blatant racism, segregation, inequality, and the struggle for civil rights in her native Mississippi. At an early age, Thea was exposed to the richness of her African American culture and spirituality, most especially the stories, the songs, the prayers, the customs, and the traditions. Moreover, she was always aware that God loved and provided for the poor and the oppressed. Her community instructed her, if you get, give. If you learn, teach. These lessons instilled in her an abiding love for God and to be charitable toward those most in need. For Sister Thea Bowman, her conversion to Catholicism was rooted in what she witnessed. She was attracted to the Catholic Church by the example of how Catholics seem to love and care for one another, most especially the poor and the needy. For Thea, she was impressed by how Catholics put their faith into action. At age 15, she told her parents and friends she wanted to join the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration and left the familiar Mississippi terrain to venture to an unfamiliar town in Wisconsin, where she would be the only African American member of her religious community. At her religious profession, she was given the name Sister Mary Thea, in honor of the Blessed Mother and her father, whose name was Theon. Her name in religious life, Thea, literally means God. She was trained to become a teacher. She taught at all grades, eventually earning her doctorate and becoming a college professor of English and linguistics. The turbulent 1960s was a period of transformation for a nation torn by racial strife and division. The United States was confronted by the quest for justice and racial equality for all Americans. The late 1960s was also a time of transformation for Sister Thea Bowman, both a spiritual and cultural awakening. The liturgical renewal of the Second Vatican Council encouraged Sister Thea to rediscover her African American religious heritage, spirituality, and to enter her beloved church, what she called fully functioning. She emphasized that cultural awareness had, as a prerequisite, intentional mutuality. She was eager to learn from other cultures, but also wanted to share the abundance of her African American culture and spirituality. Indeed, Sister Thea became a highly acclaimed evangelizer, teacher, writer, and singer, sharing the joy of the gospel and her rich cultural heritage throughout the nation. She was a founding faculty member of the Institute of Black Catholic Studies that I mentioned about in the beginning at Xavier University in New Orleans. Often donned in her customary African garb, Sister Thea Bowman would arrive to a point where she was diagnosed with cancer. Even though she at time and eventually was bound to a wheelchair, she was always had a joyful disposition, a pleasant smile, and was always at any point in time ready to break out in song. She did not let the wheelchair, the deterioration of her body due to cancer, keep her from one unprecedented event that right now you can YouTube and still see. And that is an opportunity to address the U.S. bishops at their annual June meeting held in 1989. Sister Thea spoke to the bishops as a sister having a heart-to-heart conversation with her brothers. This well-crafted, quite spontaneous message spoke of the church as her home and as her family of families and as her trying to find her way home. She explained what it meant to be African American and Catholic. She enlightened the bishops on African American history and spirituality. Sister Thea urged the bishops to continue to evangelize the African American community, to promote inclusivity, and full participation of African Americans within church leadership, and to understand the necessity and value of Catholic schools in the African American community. And when she was through, she invited the bishops to move together, cross arms, and sing with her, "We Shall Overcome." She seemingly touched the hearts of the bishops, as evidenced by their thunderous applause and tears flowing from their eyes. During her short lifetime, 52 years, many people considered her a religious sister, undeniably close to God, who lovingly invited others to encounter the presence of God in their lives. Even to this day, you will find homes for those in need, hospital wings, libraries given in her name. What you are hearing tonight, these six causes for sainthood, these individuals whom the African American community have already begun to ask to intercede for them. I ask that you reflect on these names. Reflect on what you have heard. Pick one. I invite you to investigate even further. Whose lives speaks to you? Share these stories. Give those in your community hope. Continue the work of these saints. Whatever Jesus places upon your heart, investigate it. Help the community, help the church through their lives, continue the message of peace and reconciliation. As I close, I ask you to listen to this common Negro spiritual and look at the images that you see, and join your African American brothers and sisters across the globe and ask for the intercession of these faithful ones in their work and in the message of reconciliation that Jesus has given us, primarily that he is the hope of the world and that all men should be noticed for the dignity of their lives. Please take a listen.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
I thank you for your time. Ryan, I'm going to hand it over to you so that we can answer questions.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much, Cary. Uh, so as Cary said, yeah, we're now opening to questions. So as a reminder, if you have a question, you can type it in the Q&A below, um, and we will address them as they come in. And just as a reminder, we welcome questions both about the topic of the presentation, but also about Cary's own experience in ministry to the African American Catholic community, as well as his studies in Black American Catholicism. Um, so maybe to kick us off, you mentioned towards the end of the talk, Cary, that it's important to kind of pray on these individual saints and kind of pick one, uh, maybe study them a little bit more in depth. Would you say that of the six people you talked about, you have one who you feel particularly devoted to, or who you feel is particularly kind of fitting for our times?
Well, I wouldn't say that there was one that is more fitting for our times than the other. However, that's two questions. You asked me which one that I feel a devotion to. I am one who has a very good devotion to Sister Thea Bowman. Now, the reason why is a lot of my personal, I'm a convert myself, and I was raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. So if you know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses, if anyone there does, you'll know that if you're going to be anything when you leave Jehovah's Witnesses, don't be Catholic. I mean, that is like turning to the dark side. So I say that, and I can say that tongue in cheek now, but at the time when I made the conversion, my mother completely shunned me off. So for me, um, I have a high devotion to the Blessed Mother. I think because of that absence of a mother, and in my reflection with the Blessed Mother and my conversation with the Blessed Mother, she directed me to Sister Thea Bowman, who was very motherly in herself, and her expression was very charismatic. She was very into music, particularly celebrating our African American heritage. So that's what I embrace.
Okay, so we have a question here. Is there a greater number of African American priests among the Josephites than in dioceses or in other orders?
Yes, of the 250 priests that I mentioned, there are, I want to say, 5 of those 250 priests that are diocesan priests. The overwhelming majority of the African American priests are part of a religious order. And the reason why that is historically African American priests, because for so long they were not allowed into the seminaries. So then African American priests in our history went to religious orders to fulfill their vocation, and it's continued. That's the first thing. The second reason why is a lot of African American parishes, they're pastored by priests of religious orders. So if you think about it, if you grow up in a parish, just like anybody else, and you feel the vocation, and you go to your pastor to talk about the vocation, and your pastor from a religious order, where is he more than likely going to send you? He's going to send you to the vocation person of his order, right? And so it continues that way. So that's two of the reasons why. But yes, the majority are of some religious order.
Okay, could you talk a bit about your job in the Office of Ministry to African American Catholics and kind of what you see as the unique needs of that community and how they can be addressed?
The office of, so first let me say this. You'll find the name of the office to be different depending on the makeup of the diocese, right? In our diocese, my office is called the Office of Ministry to African American Catholics. You may find other dioceses that have an office that says Black Catholic Ministries Office, right? Or you can have an office that will say Multicultural Ministries, and then they'll have a person in that office who's not the director, but a associate who works with specifically Black Catholics. So it's going to be different depending on the makeup of the diocese. My office, my responsibility, we have 4 African American parishes in the Diocese of Cleveland. Spread out across the diocese, there are approximately anywhere from 6,500 to 7,000 African American Catholics. Unfortunately, the Diocese of Cleveland, in its history, has only had one African American priest who was no longer with us. So my office has always had a significant role of kind of being the liaison between the African American Catholic community and the church. So my primary responsibility is to take care of the pastoral care of the African American Catholics in the diocese. When you ask what are some of those unique needs, pastoral needs, let's go over just the year 2000 or 2020. All right. With COVID, it is obvious, as with any pandemic that has happened in our country, communities of color generally are affected more so than white communities, primarily because there's a lack of resources. All right. There's a lack of the locations of those healthcare access points are further away from those communities. So they're hurt a little bit more. Within the parishes that are in those communities, then also are taxed. So for example, that is a special concern that is the responsibility of the parish, right? And that we have to make sure we can pastorally take their needs of those people, not just the Catholics, but even the communities that we serve. In addition to that, 2020, the incident of George Floyd, regardless of what side of the aisle you sit on the issue, it is going to raise issues in the African American community, particularly with demonstrations, with the protests that are occurring. How do you pastorally speak about these things to the community? That's an example of some of the special instances that my office is called on to take care of.
Okay, thanks. We have a question here. Are you familiar at all with the role of the Palatine sisters in African American Catholic communities?
I am not. It probably is because in Cleveland we don't have those sisters, so I'm not familiar.
Okay. And maybe as a final question, at the beginning of the talk, you raised this point about the incredible disparity in numbers of representation of African American Catholics in the laity, as well as in the clergy and leadership of the church. So what do you see as kind of concrete steps that can be taken to address that, either kind of institutional solutions or even kind of on an interpersonal level?
Well, I think the first thing that's going to come up to me, and for sake of time, I be honest with you, that's a whole nother talk of what we can do to change that. But with all due respect, probably the biggest thing we can change institutionally, and this may surprise some, is we have to embrace the sacredness of color. What I mean by that is there is so much language and representation in imagery and in our very liturgical language, which puts white as purity and anything with color as lacking sacredness. And so that if you couple that with the language that takes place in our secular world, the psychology of both white Catholics and Black Catholics, and which is scary, even Black Catholics, they have this internal oppression about their inferiority. There's not a sacredness to Blackness, right? And even something that low. So in other words, they can't even see themselves in the role of leadership in the church because they are so guilt-ridden simply because of the color of their skin. And because the psyche and the consciousness of this country is that African Americans or people of color really are in some way less than. So I think that what we have to do is work together, both white, Black, white, in our language, in our pastoral care, to have individuals of color to see themselves in those leadership roles. Once you can see yourself in that leadership role, then you're more open to the call. And then you're more open to be that trailblazer like Father Augustus told him.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks so much, Cary, for your talk tonight, for your experience and perspective. I know it was appreciated by many people. I wish it could have been in person, but such are the times. And thanks to everyone who joined us this evening. So everyone have a good night, stay safe, and God bless.